In a city where corruption runs deep and justice is for sale, Marcus Thompson thought he could trust the system, until it failed to protect his sister, Chloe. Brutally attacked and left for dead by a rogue cop, Chloe's life is shattered. But when Marcus discovers that the man who hurt her is part of a web of corruption that stretches to the highest echelons of power, he vows to expose the truth, no matter the cost. With the help of a relentless journalist, a disillusioned cop, and his fiercely determined sister, Marcus is drawn into a deadly game of cat and mouse. As they race against time to bring their enemies to justice, they uncover secrets that powerful figures would kill to keep hidden. But when their quest for justice reveals a ruthless mastermind who will stop at nothing to protect his empire, Marcus and Chloe must decide how far they're willing to go to bring the truth to light. With betrayal lurking at every turn and a ticking clock threatening their every move, one thing becomes clear: in a world where darkness thrives, the fight for justice may cost them everything. Based on a true story. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The night was cold, the air sharp with the scent of snow. Chloe Thompson gripped the steering wheel of her car, squinting through the windshield as she drove down a narrow, isolated road. The streetlights were sparse, casting long shadows across the icy ground. It was well past 10 p.m., and all she could think about was getting home to the warmth of her apartment after a long, grueling day at work. She had stayed late, preparing a presentation that could secure her a promotion. For years, Chloe had worked tirelessly, proving herself over and over at the prestigious law firm where she was one of the few black women on staff. Tonight, she was supposed to celebrate with her brother, Marcus, but as she glanced at the cake box on the passenger seat, her excitement was tinged with exhaustion. The sudden flash of red and blue lights behind her jolted her out of her thoughts. A police cruiser was tailing her, lights flashing, its siren blaring briefly before cutting off. Chloe's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been speeding, in fact, she had been driving cautiously on the slick roads. Confused but compliant, she slowed down and pulled over to the side of the deserted road, the frozen lake on her right shimmering under the moonlight. As she put her car in park, a tall figure emerged from the police vehicle. Detective Daniel Grayson. His reputation preceded him, whispered stories of brutality, particularly against people of color. Chloe's pulse quickened, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. The last thing she needed was trouble. Grayson's heavy boots crunched on the icy road as he approached. Chloe rolled down her window just enough to speak. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Grayson's cold, blue eyes bore into her, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Why? What did I do?" Chloe's voice wavered slightly, but she tried to project confidence. She knew her rights. Grayson's smile vanished, replaced by a look of irritation. "I said, get out of the car," he barked, slamming his fist on the roof. The force of the blow sent a shiver through Chloe. Reluctantly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, the freezing air hitting her like a slap. As soon as she was out, Grayson shoved her roughly against the side of her car, patting her down with an aggression that was more about dominance than protocol. Chloe's breath came out in sharp bursts, forming small clouds in the frigid air. The cold was seeping through her thin coat, and fear was beginning to gnaw at her insides. "What is this about?" Chloe protested, her voice catching in her throat. Grayson didn't answer. Instead, he leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "You think you can just drive around here at this hour, looking suspicious? People like you are always up to no good." Chloe's heart pounded in her chest, her instincts screaming at her to run. "I haven't done anything wrong," she insisted, trying to hold her ground. But the trembling in her voice betrayed her fear. The situation escalated in a flash. Grayson grabbed her by the arm, twisting it painfully behind her back. Chloe cried out, but the deserted road remained silent, the only witnesses the tall, bare trees surrounding them. Grayson dragged her toward the edge of the frozen lake, her feet slipping on the icy ground. "Let go of me!" Chloe screamed, panic taking over as she struggled against his iron grip. In a desperate bid, she reached for her phone in her pocket, trying to start a recording, but Grayson was faster. He slapped the phone out of her hand, sending it skittering across the ice. "You think you're smart, huh?" he snarled, his face contorted with rage. Without warning, he forced her down to her knees on the icy shore. Chloe's cries were muffled as Grayson shoved her head into the freezing water. The shock of the icy water hitting her face was like 1,000 needles piercing her skin. She thrashed, her lungs burning as she tried to break free, but Grayson's grip was unyielding. The cold was overwhelming, and she felt herself slipping into a panicked haze. The world was reduced to the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears and the muffled roar of the water. Just as Chloe's vision began to blur, headlights appeared in the distance. Grayson yanked her up roughly, throwing her onto the frozen ground. She gasped for air, coughing violently, her body trembling uncontrollably. "Consider this a warning," Grayson hissed, his voice dripping with menace. "No one's going to believe a word you say. And if you do try, I'll make sure you and your family regret it." Chloe lay there, her soaked clothes clinging to her shivering frame, unable to respond. Grayson shot her one last contemptuous glance before striding back to his cruiser. As he drove away, the taillights faded into the darkness, leaving Chloe alone in the icy silence. With every ounce of strength left, she dragged herself to her car. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get her keys into the ignition. She managed to call Marcus, her voice barely more than a whisper as she begged him to come quickly. When Marcus arrived, he found her huddled in the front seat, her face bruised, her eyes wide with shock. Without a word, he wrapped her in a blanket and drove her to the hospital. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white, rage simmering beneath the surface. As he looked at his sister's battered face, Marcus's heart filled with a resolve that would not break. Chloe might be terrified, but he would not let this go unanswered. Detective Grayson had made a powerful enemy tonight, and Marcus Thompson would stop at nothing to bring him to justice. The hospital waiting room was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Marcus Thompson paced back and forth, running a hand over his tired eyes. It had been hours since he brought Chloe in, hours since the doctors rushed her into an exam room to treat her for hypothermia and the bruises that marred her face. Every second felt like an eternity. The image of Chloe's broken, shivering form haunted him, each thought tightening the knot of rage in his chest. He was supposed to protect her, supposed to keep her safe. And yet, she had been brutalized by a man who wore a badge. Finally, the door to the exam room swung open, and a nurse stepped out, her expression grim. "Mr. Thompson," she called softly. Marcus rushed over, his heart pounding. "How is she?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "Physically, she'll recover," the nurse said, her voice gentle. "But she's traumatized. We've done everything we can to stabilize her, but she's still in shock. She needs rest and support." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before lowering her voice. "I heard what happened. If you decide to report this, you'll need evidence. You know how these things go." Marcus clenched his fists. "Thank you," he managed, before turning away to check on his sister. Inside the small, sterile hospital room, Chloe lay on the bed, her eyes half open and unfocused. When Marcus approached, she flinched, her body tensing up. It broke his heart to see his sister, once so confident and full of life, reduced to this fragile state. "Chloe, it's me," he said softly, taking her cold hand in his. Her fingers were like ice, even under the hospital blanket. "I'm here. You're safe now." Tears welled up in Chloe's eyes. "Marcus, he said no one would believe me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He said if I talked, he'd come after you too. Marcus's jaw tightened. We're not letting him get away with this, he vowed, stroking her hand gently. I'm going to report him, and we'll make sure he pays. But deep down, Marcus knew it wouldn't be that simple. Detective Daniel Grayson was infamous within certain circles, a cop with a reputation for making problems disappear, particularly when it involved people who looked like them. This would not be an easy fight. The next morning, after ensuring Chloe was settled with a trusted friend, Marcus headed to the downtown police precinct. The sun was barely up, and the city was still wrapped in the sleepy hush of early morning. But Marcus's mind was racing, a plan forming as he approached the front desk. I need to report an assault, Marcus said to the disinterested desk sergeant, sliding his ID across the counter. My sister was attacked last night by one of your officers, Detective Grayson. The sergeant's expression didn't change as he glanced at Marcus's ID, then back at him. Do you have an appointment? He asked, in a tone that suggested Marcus was wasting his time. An appointment? Marcus snapped, barely able to contain his frustration. My sister was beaten and nearly drowned by one of your men. This is an emergency. The sergeant shrugged. Fill out a report. Someone will get to it. He pushed a stack of forms across the counter. Marcus's hands trembled with barely restrained fury. I want to speak to someone in internal affairs, he demanded. Now. The sergeant gave him a cold smile. Internal affairs doesn't see walk-ins, he said flatly. If you've got a problem, fill out the paperwork. Marcus snatched the forms, his blood boiling. As he turned to find a seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in the precinct was watching him, not with curiosity, but with a warning in their eyes. This was Grayson's territory, and they were making it clear that Marcus was not welcome here. An hour later, after filling out the forms and submitting his complaint, Marcus was met with more resistance. The officer who finally called him into a small, windowless room to take his statement was dismissive, yawning as he listened. So, you're saying your sister claims that Detective Grayson assaulted her, the officer said, barely looking up from his notes. But you don't have any witnesses, no video, no corroborating evidence? Marcus's patience was wearing thin. My sister nearly died last night. She has bruises, she's traumatized. Isn't that enough? The officer shrugged. Look, I'll file your report, he said in a bored tone, but without solid evidence, there's not much we can do. Besides, Grayson's a respected detective. You really think anyone's going to believe your sister's story over his word? Marcus's fists clenched under the table. This was exactly what he had feared. The system was rigged against them, protecting its own while ignoring the voices of those it was supposed to serve. As Marcus left the precinct, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Drop it, Thompson. If you know what's good for you. He stared at the words, his pulse quickening. They were already trying to silence him. But if they thought he would back down, they were dead wrong. Grayson had made a mistake by targeting Chloe, and Marcus would make sure he paid for it. Walking out into the crisp morning air, Marcus felt a surge of determination. If the police wouldn't help, he would find another way. He would get the evidence he needed, even if it meant taking on Grayson himself. No one was going to hurt his sister and walk away unscathed. This was only the beginning. Marcus's mind was racing as he drove through the city streets, the gray sky above him threatening snow. Vanessa's leads were promising, but they still lacked the solid proof needed to bring down Grayson. Every day that passed felt like another failure, another day that Chloe's attacker walked free. He couldn't shake the image of Chloe's bruised face and the fear in her eyes. She had always been the strong one, the one who believed in the system even when Marcus had his doubts. But now, that faith was shattered, and he was determined to pick up the pieces. As Marcus turned onto the quiet residential street where Chloe was staying, he could see her through the living room window, sitting alone on the couch, staring at her phone. She looked so small, so defeated, and it tore at his heart. He parked the car and took a deep breath before stepping out. Chloe needed him to be strong. He couldn't afford to show the fear and frustration bubbling inside him. When he let himself in, Chloe barely looked up. Her eyes were red and puffy, evidence of sleepless nights and too many tears. Marcus's chest tightened, but he forced a smile as he sat down next to her. "Hey, sis," he said softly. "How are you holding up?" Chloe shrugged, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know. I feel like I'm drowning, Marcus. Everywhere I turn, I see his face. I can't sleep. I can't think." Marcus took her hand gently, trying to steady his own trembling fingers. "We're going to get through this. I promise you, we'll make Grayson pay." Chloe's eyes darted to the window, as if she expected Grayson to be standing there, watching. "Marcus, you don't understand, he's not just some rogue cop. He's connected to something bigger." Marcus's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Chloe, if there's something you know, you have to tell me. I can't help you unless you're honest with me." Chloe hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sweater. Marcus could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she seemed to be waging a silent battle with herself. Finally, she exhaled shakily and pulled something out from behind the cushion of the couch, a small, battered flash drive. She handed it to Marcus, her hands trembling. "What is this?" he asked, looking down at the device. It's why Grayson came after me," Chloe confessed, her voice breaking. "A few weeks ago, at the firm, I overheard a conversation between two partners. They were talking about some big deal, something about a contract with the city. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I saw Grayson meeting with them late one night. I got curious, so I took a risk and copied some files." Marcus's heart pounded. "You took files from your firm? Chloe, that's dangerous. You know how powerful those people are." "I didn't realize how deep it went," Chloe said, her eyes welling with tears. "But after I copied the files, I started noticing things. Strange cars parked outside my apartment, people following me. I was going to tell you, but then Grayson found me." Marcus's mind was reeling. This was bigger than he had imagined. It wasn't just about a dirty cop, it was about something much larger, something that could take down powerful people if it came to light. "Have you looked at what's on this drive?" Marcus asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Chloe shook her head. "No. I was too scared. And after what he did, I just couldn't bring myself to look. But I knew I had to keep it hidden." Marcus plugged the flash drive into his laptop, his heart racing as the screen flickered to life. As the files loaded, he saw a series of contracts, emails, and spreadsheets detailing payouts and city contracts. But it was one document in particular that caught his eye, a list of names, all prominent figures in the city, with dollar amounts next to them. This is evidence of a bribery ring," Marcus muttered. "Grayson's not just a thug, he's a middleman in a massive corruption scheme." Chloe nodded, wiping her tears. "That's why he tried to kill me. I think he found out I had this." Marcus's blood boiled. Grayson had tried to silence Chloe because she had stumbled onto the truth. And now, they had the evidence to take him down. But it wouldn't be easy. The names on that list were powerful people who would do anything to protect themselves. "I need to get this to Vanessa," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. "She'll know what to do with it. If we can leak this information, we might have a chance to put Grayson and his allies behind bars." But Chloe grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Marcus, you can't. If they find out you have this, they'll come after you too. They won't stop until we're both dead." Marcus looked into his sister's eyes and saw the terror there, but he also saw something else: trust. Chloe was depending on him to make this right. "I won't let them hurt you again," Marcus vowed. "I don't care how powerful they are. I'm not stopping until I see Grayson brought to justice." But as he spoke, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. "We know what you have. Drop it, or we'll finish what we started." Marcus's blood ran cold. They were already watching. But this time, he wasn't backing down. If they thought he would abandon his sister, they had severely underestimated him. Clenching his jaw, Marcus typed a quick message to Vanessa, attaching a copy of the files. "I'm sending these to someone I trust," he told Chloe. "We're going to fight this, but I need you to be strong." Chloe nodded, her eyes fierce despite the fear. "I trust you, Marcus. Just, be careful. I can't lose you too." As Marcus sent the files, he knew they were stepping into dangerous territory. The game had changed, and now, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about exposing a web of corruption that could destroy everything they held dear. This was no longer just a fight for justice. It was a fight for survival. The sound of bustling traffic filled the air as Marcus stood at the corner of 34th Street, anxiously scanning the crowd. Vanessa had set up a meeting with a source, someone from within the police department who had reached out anonymously, claiming to have information on Detective Grayson. Marcus didn't know who to expect or what they had to offer, but he was desperate for anything that could help him build a case against the man who attacked his sister. The cold wind bit into his skin, making him pull his coat tighter around his shoulders. Chloe's revelation about the files had been a game-changer, but it had also put them in greater danger. They needed more evidence, something indisputable that could tie Grayson and his allies directly to the corruption detailed in the documents. "Mr. Thompson?" A voice came from behind him. Marcus turned quickly, his instincts on high alert. Standing before him was a middle-aged man in a worn police jacket, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked around nervously, his posture tense. "That's me," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady. "And you are?" "Call me Ramirez," the man muttered, refusing to make eye contact. "We need to move. It's not safe to talk here." Marcus followed Ramirez into a nearby alleyway, where the sounds of the city faded into a distant hum. The narrow space smelled faintly of garbage, the walls covered in graffiti. Marcus felt his heart race, but he pushed down his anxiety. This was his best lead yet. Ramirez glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "I've been a cop for 15 years, he said quietly. "I've seen a lot of dirty things, but Grayson, he's on another level. He's got his hands in everything: drugs, bribes, extortion. You name it, he's done it." Marcus nodded, trying to keep the impatience out of his voice. "I need more than stories. I need proof, something that can hold up in court." Ramirez shifted uncomfortably. "You don't get it. Grayson's got people everywhere. He's not just some crooked cop. He's protected by people high up, people who'd rather see me dead than talking to you right now." The intensity in Ramirez's voice sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "Then why are you risking this?" Marcus asked. Ramirez's eyes flicked up to meet Marcus's for the first time. "Because I've seen what he does to people who cross him. Your sister, she's lucky to be alive. But others haven't been so fortunate. I've stayed quiet for too long, but after what he did to that girl, I can't live with myself if I don't do something." Marcus's jaw clenched. Chloe's pale face and haunted eyes flashed through his mind. "So, what do you have for me?" he pressed. Ramirez reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. "This is a list of transactions, payoffs from local businesses, politicians, even some from your sister's law firm. They've been funneling money to Grayson for years to protect their dirty deals. Marcus took the envelope and quickly glanced through the papers. It was a treasure trove of incriminating information, names, dates, and amounts that directly tied Grayson to the city's elite. But it still wasn't enough. They needed a smoking gun, something that couldn't be explained away as hearsay or coincidence. "This is good, but it's not enough," Marcus said, his frustration showing. "I need something more concrete. Something that links Grayson to the assaults and murders." Ramirez hesitated, looking down at his feet. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Grayson's been using an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town as his base of operations. Drugs, money, even bodies. It's where he keeps everything he wants off the books. If you can get in there, you might find what you're looking for." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. This was it, a real chance to gather irrefutable evidence. But breaking into a warehouse guarded by Grayson's men would be a dangerous gamble. "Can you get me inside?" Marcus asked, trying to contain his excitement. Ramirez shook his head. "I can't. If they catch me helping you, I'm dead. But I can give you the layout, the security schedule. After that, you're on your own." Marcus nodded. "That's more than enough. Thank you, Ramirez. You're doing the right thing." But as Marcus turned to leave, Ramirez grabbed his arm. "Be careful," he warned, his eyes wide with fear. "Grayson won't hesitate to kill anyone who threatens him. And if he finds out you're coming, he won't let your sister survive a second time." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air as Marcus walked back toward his car. He glanced down at his phone, where Vanessa had been texting him updates. She was waiting to hear if Ramirez came through, and he was eager to share what he had learned. When he climbed into his car and called her, Vanessa picked up on the first ring. "Well?" she asked, her voice taut with anticipation. "I've got something," Marcus said, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Ramirez gave me intel on a warehouse Grayson's using. If we can get in, we might be able to find the evidence we need." Vanessa was silent for a moment. "You realize how risky that is, right? If you get caught." "I know," Marcus cut in. "But we're running out of time. Grayson's people already know we're digging. They've sent me threats. We can't just sit back and wait for them to make the next move." Vanessa sighed. "All right. I'll reach out to some contacts and see if we can get backup. But Marcus, be careful. We're getting close, and that makes us dangerous." Marcus hung up, staring out the windshield into the darkening sky. Chloe's attackers were still out there, watching, waiting for their chance to strike again. But now, he had something they didn't expect, allies willing to take risks, to expose the truth. As he drove away, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. A black SUV had been parked across the street when he met with Ramirez, and it had been behind him for the last few blocks. Was it Grayson's men? Or just a coincidence? Marcus pressed his foot on the gas, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He couldn't afford to be paranoid, but he also couldn't let his guard down. Not now. Because this was more than just a fight for justice. It was a race against time to protect everyone he loved, before Grayson made good on his threats. The evening air was heavy with the threat of snow as Marcus approached the familiar brick building that housed his mentor's law office. It had been days since Marcus had spoken with David, his former mentor and one of the few people he trusted implicitly. If anyone could provide legal advice and guidance on how to handle the sensitive information he had gathered, it would be David. But even as Marcus walked up the creaking stairs to David's office on the second floor, a gnawing feeling of unease tugged at his gut. The past week had been a whirlwind of secrets, threats, and near misses. Trust was a rare currency, and Marcus was rapidly running out of people to rely on. He reached the door to David's office and paused. The light under the door was dim, casting a faint glow into the dark hallway. Marcus knocked twice and waited, hearing the soft murmur of voices inside. After a moment, the door swung open, revealing David's familiar figure. "Marcus, my boy," David greeted him with a warm smile, though there was a tightness around his eyes that Marcus hadn't noticed before. "Come in. I was just finishing up a call." As Marcus stepped inside, the comforting smell of leather and old books surrounded him. David's office was lined with shelves overflowing with legal volumes and framed certificates, a testament to his years of dedication to the law. But today, it felt different, colder, almost oppressive. "Thanks for seeing me on such short notice," Marcus said, lowering himself into the worn leather chair opposite David's massive mahogany desk. "Of course, Marcus. You know I'm always here for you," David replied, sitting back in his chair with a carefully measured smile. "But I have to admit, I've been hearing some concerning things. I hear you've been digging into some dangerous territory." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I've got evidence, David. Real evidence. Grayson isn't just a dirty cop, he's part of a network of corruption that reaches into the highest levels of the city. I have files, records, everything we need to bring him down." David's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. "Marcus, listen to me. You're playing with fire here. These are powerful people. If you keep pushing, they will destroy you." Marcus's jaw clenched. "I can't just walk away, David. They nearly killed Chloe. I won't let them get away with it." David sighed, rubbing his temples. "I understand your anger, but you need to think rationally. Sometimes, the best course of action is to step back. Let this go. For your sister's sake, and your own." Marcus stared at David, trying to process what he was hearing. This wasn't the man he had looked up to for years, the man who had taught him to fight for justice. "Are you saying I should just let them get away with it?" Marcus asked, incredulous. David leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I'm saying that not every battle is worth fighting, Marcus. You can't win this. Walk away before you get yourself killed." But Marcus wasn't backing down. "I came to you for help, David. Not to be told to give up." David's eyes hardened. "You think you're the first person to try to take down Grayson? You think you're special because you've got a few documents? They've buried people for less. And if you're not careful, they'll bury you too." Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, unknown number. Another anonymous threat? He ignored the call, his focus still on David. But then the door to the office creaked open, and Marcus turned to see two men standing there, men he recognized from his earlier surveillance of Grayson's associates. His heart skipped a beat. What were they doing here? "David," Marcus said slowly, turning back to his mentor. "What's going on?" David sighed heavily, the mask of concern slipping from his face. "I tried to warn you, Marcus," he said quietly. "But you just had to keep pushing." Marcus's mind reeled. You're working with them?" The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The one person he thought he could trust had been playing him all along. David stood up, his expression cold and unreadable. "You don't understand, Marcus. These people, they control everything. I had no choice." Marcus leapt to his feet, his fists clenched. "You betrayed me. You betrayed Chloe." Before Marcus could react, the two men lunged forward, grabbing him by the arms. He struggled, but they were too strong. One of them drove a fist into his stomach, knocking the wind out of him. As Marcus doubled over, gasping for breath, David stepped closer, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I warned you, Marcus," David said, his tone almost regretful. "You should have listened." The men dragged Marcus out of the office and down the narrow stairwell, his mind spinning with disbelief and fury. His mentor, the man who had taught him everything he knew, was in league with the very people Marcus was trying to expose. As they threw him into the back of a black SUV, Marcus's mind raced. He had to find a way out, had to warn Vanessa and Chloe. If David was involved, then the entire conspiracy ran deeper than he had imagined. The SUV sped off, the city lights blurring as they drove deeper into the industrial outskirts. Marcus's hands were bound, his ribs aching from the earlier blow. He forced himself to focus, to think clearly. He couldn't afford to panic. The vehicle came to a sudden stop, and the men hauled Marcus out, dragging him toward an abandoned building. Marcus could hear the faint sound of water dripping and the distant hum of machinery. It was the warehouse Ramirez had mentioned. The doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit space filled with crates and shadows. One of the men shoved Marcus to his knees, his breath coming in painful gasps. They left him there, bound and beaten, as they disappeared into the darkness. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself a sliver of despair. He had been betrayed, beaten, and dragged into the lion's den. But he couldn't give up now. Chloe was depending on him. Taking a deep breath, he focused on loosening the bindings on his wrists. The moment he freed himself, he would find a way to escape. He had to, for Chloe, for the truth, and for everyone who had been wronged by the likes of Grayson and David. This was no longer just about justice. This was about survival. The low hum of the heater filled the silence as Chloe sat curled up on the worn couch in her friend Jenna's apartment. She had been hiding here for the past few days, recovering from the attack and trying to stay under the radar while Marcus pursued Grayson. But with every passing day, the anxiety gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Vanessa, sending her updates on Marcus's progress. Chloe's stomach twisted with worry as she read the messages. Marcus had been taken, kidnapped by Grayson's men. Vanessa had only found out moments ago and was desperately trying to locate him. Chloe's hands trembled as she read the words. "No, no, this can't be happening," she whispered. Marcus was the one person she could always count on, the one who had always protected her. Now, he was the one in danger. For a moment, Chloe was paralyzed by fear. But then, something inside her snapped. She couldn't just sit here waiting for news. She had to do something. She owed it to Marcus, and to herself. With a newfound resolve, she stood up and hurried to her bag, pulling out the small, battered laptop she had hidden there. It was time to reveal her secret. Ever since the night of her attack, Chloe had been too terrified to tell Marcus everything she knew. She had kept her own investigation a secret, afraid that if Grayson found out, he would come after her again. But now that Marcus's life was on the line, she realized she could no longer hold back. Taking a deep breath, she plugged in the flash drive she had taken from her law firm. The files flickered to life on the screen, documents, emails, and spreadsheets that she had painstakingly gathered in the weeks before Grayson attacked her. As the files loaded, Chloe's eyes scanned the familiar names and transactions. This was the evidence she had been too afraid to share, evidence that could not only expose Grayson but also bring down the powerful figures behind him. Chloe had suspected that her firm was involved in something shady, but she hadn't realized just how deep it went until she saw the payments linked directly to city officials. Her heart pounded as she opened the latest folder. There it was, a detailed blueprint of the warehouse Marcus had mentioned before he disappeared. It wasn't just a warehouse, it was Grayson's base of operations, where he stored his most damning secrets. Chloe's mind raced. If she could get this information to Vanessa, they could expose everything. But Vanessa was busy trying to find Marcus, and they couldn't afford to waste any more time. Chloe had to act. Grabbing her phone, Chloe quickly texted Vanessa. "I have new evidence. I know where Marcus is being held. I'm going to the warehouse. Vanessa's response came almost immediately. Chloe, don't do anything reckless. Wait for me. But Chloe knew she couldn't wait. Marcus's life was hanging by a thread, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing him. Taking a deep breath, she packed up her laptop and stuffed it into her backpack. She pulled on her coat, wrapping herself against the cold, and slipped out of the apartment. The streets were eerily quiet as Chloe made her way to the warehouse district. Snow had begun to fall, blanketing the city in a cold, silent white. Her heart was racing, every step feeling like a countdown to a moment she couldn't predict. She had never done anything like this before, walking straight into the lion's den with nothing but her wits and a flash drive full of evidence. As she approached the warehouse, she could see the faint glow of lights filtering through the cracked windows. She crept closer, her breath fogging in the icy air. The building loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, with the faint sound of machinery humming inside. Taking a deep breath, Chloe slipped into the shadows and made her way to a side entrance. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. She pressed her ear to the metal door, listening for any sounds on the other side. All she could hear was the faint murmur of voices, but they were too far away to make out. With trembling hands, Chloe pulled out the small device she had brought with her, a digital recorder Marcus had given her years ago. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. If she could record a conversation, something that confirmed what was in the documents, it would be enough to blow the case wide open. She pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, the smell of oil and rust heavy in the air. Chloe kept to the shadows, her eyes scanning the space for any sign of Marcus. Her heart sank when she saw a group of men standing near the far wall, their backs turned to her. And then, she heard his voice. "Let him go." Marcus shouted, his voice raw with pain. "You've got what you wanted. Just let me go." Chloe's breath hitched. They had him tied to a chair, his face bloodied and bruised. She had never seen her brother like this, so broken, so vulnerable. Anger surged through her veins, but she forced herself to stay hidden. She had to be smart. She couldn't let her emotions get the best of her. One of the men stepped forward, his voice low and menacing. "We're not done yet, Thompson. We know you've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong. Your little sister won't save you this time." Chloe clenched her fists, her fear giving way to a steely resolve. She had to find a way to help Marcus, but she couldn't afford to be reckless. If she was caught, they would both be dead. She edged closer, hiding behind a stack of crates. She pressed the record button on her device, hoping to capture the conversation. But as she moved, her foot caught on a loose piece of metal, sending it clattering to the ground. The men turned instantly, their eyes narrowing as they spotted her. "Who's there?" one of them barked, drawing a gun. Chloe's heart leapt into her throat, but she forced herself to stay calm. "It's over," she called out, stepping into the light. "I have everything I need to expose you. If you don't let him go, I'll release it all." The men hesitated, their eyes flicking to each other. Marcus's gaze locked onto Chloe, a mix of horror and relief in his eyes. "Chloe, no. Get out of here," he shouted. But Chloe stood her ground, clutching the flash drive in her hand like a lifeline. "Let him go," she repeated, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Or everyone will know what you've done." The warehouse fell into a tense silence, broken only by the soft sound of snow falling outside. Chloe's gamble had paid off, for now. But she knew this was just the beginning. There was no turning back. Snow fell heavily outside the warehouse, the thick flakes absorbing all sound and leaving the city shrouded in an almost eerie silence. The cold air bit at Chloe's exposed skin as she stood her ground, clutching the flash drive tightly in her hand. Her heart raced as Grayson's men exchanged tense glances, trying to decide whether she was bluffing. Marcus, still tied to the chair, was struggling to get free, his eyes locked on Chloe. "Get out of here, Chloe. This is too dangerous," he shouted, his voice hoarse from earlier blows. But Chloe ignored him, taking a step closer. She could feel her pulse thundering in her ears, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm serious," she said, waving the flash drive. "This has everything, the payoffs, the dirty contracts, the names. If anything happens to us, it goes public." One of the men, a burly thug with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward, narrowing his eyes. "You think we're scared of a little piece of plastic? You're bluffing, girl," he growled. Chloe's mind raced, trying to think of her next move. She could see Marcus desperately trying to work his hands free from the ropes that bound him. She needed to buy him more time. "I'm not bluffing," she insisted. "If I don't check in with my contact in the next 30 minutes, the files will be sent to every news outlet in the city." The men hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. Chloe's threat had struck a nerve. She could tell they weren't prepared to deal with a potential media storm, especially one that could expose not just Grayson, but the powerful figures he worked for. "Who's your contact?" the scar-faced man demanded, raising his gun and pointing it at Chloe. She swallowed hard, forcing herself not to flinch. "You really think I'm going to tell you that? If anything happens to me or my brother, it's over for all of you." At that moment, Marcus managed to slip one hand free from the ropes binding him. His eyes met Chloe's, and she knew he was waiting for the right moment to strike. But they were running out of time. Grayson's men were getting agitated, and if they realized she was bluffing, they would kill them both on the spot. The door to the warehouse burst open with a loud crash, the freezing wind howling as Vanessa stormed in, her phone in one hand and a determined expression on her face. "Hold it right there," she shouted, holding up her phone. "This entire conversation is being streamed live. If you shoot them, the whole world will know." The men froze, their eyes widening in shock. Vanessa's bluff was bold, but it bought Marcus the distraction he needed. With a swift, practiced move, he lunged forward, grabbing a fallen metal pipe and swinging it at the nearest thug. The man crumpled to the ground with a grunt, while Chloe ducked behind a stack of crates for cover. Chaos erupted in the warehouse. One of the men fired a shot that whizzed past Vanessa's head, missing her by inches. She dropped to the ground, her phone clattering away, but the screen was still lit, the blinking red dot indicating that it was indeed recording. Chloe's mind was in overdrive. They had to get out, but they still needed to secure the evidence. She sprinted toward Marcus, who was now fighting off another thug. "Marcus! We have to go, now!" she yelled, her voice barely audible over the commotion. Marcus landed a solid punch on his attacker, sending the man sprawling. "We can't leave without the files," he shouted back. He grabbed Chloe's arm, pulling her toward the back of the warehouse where he had seen a computer station. Vanessa, meanwhile, had managed to retrieve her phone and was now ducking behind a pillar, frantically texting her contacts for backup. The men were regrouping, realizing that Vanessa's live stream was a bluff. The leader, Scarface, barked orders to his men, his voice filled with rage. "Don't let them escape. We can't let this go public," he snarled, aiming his gun toward Marcus and Chloe as they reached the computer station. Chloe quickly plugged the flash drive into the computer, her hands shaking as she navigated through the files. "We need to upload everything," she said, her voice trembling. "If we can get it to the cloud, we can expose them before they can stop us." Marcus stood guard, using a metal pipe to fend off anyone who got too close. "Hurry, Chloe. We don't have much time." Vanessa joined them, panting. "I've called for backup, but they're at least 15 minutes away. We need to buy more time." Chloe's fingers flew across the keyboard, uploading file after file. But the connection was painfully slow, and every second felt like an eternity. The men were closing in, their guns raised, their eyes filled with murderous intent. Scarface stepped forward, aiming his gun directly at Chloe. "Stop right there or I'll blow your head off," he shouted, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Chloe didn't stop. She couldn't. If they didn't get these files out, everything they had risked, Marcus's life, Vanessa's career, and her own safety, would be for nothing. She pressed the final button, sending the files to a secure server just as a deafening gunshot rang out. Marcus tackled Chloe to the ground, shielding her with his body as the bullet ricocheted off the metal desk behind them. "It's done!" Chloe screamed. "The files are out." The men hesitated, realizing that their worst fear had just come true. The evidence was now beyond their reach, scattered to the far corners of the internet. There was no stopping it now. Vanessa held up her phone triumphantly, showing the flashing notifications on the screen. "It's all over the news," she said, grinning despite the blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. "Grayson and his cronies are done." For a moment, it seemed like everything had stopped. The men lowered their weapons, their faces pale. In that split second of confusion, Marcus, Chloe, and Vanessa made a break for the exit, sprinting toward the alleyway behind the warehouse. As they burst through the door into the cold night air, the sound of distant sirens filled the air. Vanessa's contacts had come through, and the police were finally on their way. But Marcus knew this wasn't the end. Grayson was still out there, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. But for now, they had won a small victory. The evidence was out, and the world would finally see the truth. He turned to Chloe, who was panting heavily, her eyes wide with adrenaline. "You did it, Chloe. You saved us." She gave him a shaky smile, tears welling in her eyes. "I couldn't let him hurt you, Marcus. Not again." As the sirens grew louder, Marcus pulled his sister into a tight embrace. They had survived this battle, but the war was far from over. Grayson would be coming for them with everything he had. But for now, they had bought themselves a little more time, and a chance to fight back. The sirens were fading into the distance as Marcus, Chloe, and Vanessa hurried through the shadowy streets of the industrial district. The freezing air cut into their skin, each breath visible in the cold night. They had escaped the warehouse with their lives, but Marcus knew they were still far from safe. Grayson's men wouldn't give up that easily. "Where do we go now?" Chloe asked, her voice shaky as she struggled to keep up with Marcus's long strides. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but the fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. Vanessa, catching her breath, glanced around before nodding toward a narrow alleyway. "I have a safe house nearby," she said, wiping a trickle of blood from her forehead. "We can regroup there, at least until we figure out our next move." Marcus gave her a wary look. "You sure it's safe? Grayson has eyes everywhere." Vanessa's lips tightened into a grim smile. "It's safe. Trust me. I've used it before when I needed to disappear for a while." They moved quickly through the maze of alleys, the snow crunching underfoot. Finally, they reached a nondescript door tucked between two dilapidated buildings. Vanessa punched in a code on a hidden keypad, and with a faint beep, the door clicked open. "Welcome to my little hideout," Vanessa said as they stepped inside. The space was small but secure, with blackout curtains covering the windows and a row of monitors displaying live feeds from hidden cameras outside. Marcus let out a sigh of relief as they entered the warmth of the room. Chloe immediately sank onto the worn leather couch, her face pale from exhaustion. Vanessa poured her a glass of water and handed it over. "You did good, Chloe," she said softly. "We wouldn't have made it out of there without you." Chloe nodded weakly, taking a sip. I couldn't let them take Marcus." Marcus knelt down beside his sister, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said. Grayson is going to come after us harder now that the files are out. We need more than just evidence. We need someone who can actually take him down. As if on cue, Vanessa's phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at the screen, her eyes widening slightly. "This might be the break we've been waiting for," she said, looking up at Marcus. "I've been in contact with someone who can help us, someone from the inside." Marcus frowned. "Who is it?" Before Vanessa could respond, there was a knock on the door. Marcus tensed, reaching for the metal pipe he had picked up during their escape, but Vanessa held up a hand. "It's okay. I was expecting him." She opened the door to reveal a figure standing in the shadows. The man stepped into the light, revealing the worn face of Officer Ramirez, the same cop who had risked his life to provide Marcus with the initial intel on Grayson. "Ramirez," Marcus said, surprise and relief flooding through him. "I thought you were laying low." Ramirez gave a tired nod, his eyes darting around the room. "I was, but after I saw the files you released, I knew I had to help." "You're getting close, Marcus, closer than anyone has before. But Grayson's not going to go down without a fight. Why are you risking so much to help us?" Chloe asked, her voice soft but steady. Ramirez hesitated, running a hand through his graying hair. "Because I'm tired of being complicit," he admitted. "I've looked the other way for years while Grayson and his cronies tore this city apart. But your brother, he's willing to stand up to them. I figured it was time I did too." Vanessa nodded. "We need all the help we can get. Grayson's people are going to try to spin this. They'll say the files are fake, that it's a smear campaign." Ramirez stepped forward, his expression resolute. "I have something that might change that," he said, pulling a small recorder out of his jacket pocket. "Grayson doesn't know I've been recording our conversations. I've got him on tape talking about the murders, the payoffs, everything." Marcus's eyes widened. "That's the smoking gun we need. If we can get this to the press, Grayson won't be able to wriggle out of it." Ramirez shook his head. "It's not that simple. We can't just release this to the media. Grayson's people will discredit it before it even makes the evening news. We need to deliver it to someone who can protect it, and us." Marcus paced the room, thinking. "We need someone in law enforcement, but not just anyone. Someone high enough up the chain that they can't be bought off." Vanessa's eyes lit up. "There's one person who might fit the bill," she said. "Judge Harrington. He's been an outspoken critic of police corruption. If we can get the evidence to him, he could issue a warrant against Grayson." Chloe looked doubtful. "But how do we get to him? If Grayson finds out we're trying to go to the judge, he'll come after us with everything he's got." Ramirez straightened, determination in his eyes. "Leave that to me. I've got a few contacts in the courthouse who owe me favors. I can get you a meeting with Harrington, but it has to be tomorrow. The judge is leaving for a conference after that." "A ticking clock," Marcus muttered, rubbing his temples. "We have less than 24 hours. Vanessa nodded. "We need to be smart about this. If Grayson gets wind of what we're planning, he'll shut us down before we even get to the courthouse." Marcus turned to Chloe, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've done more than enough, Chloe. You should stay here where it's safe." But Chloe shook her head fiercely. "No. I'm not letting you go out there alone again. If we're doing this, we're doing it together." Marcus's heart swelled with pride and fear. He couldn't lose her, but he also knew they stood a better chance if they worked together. Ramirez, Vanessa, Marcus, and Chloe were now a team bound by desperation and the need for justice. "All right," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Tomorrow morning, we get that recording to Judge Harrington. We need to be ready for anything. They're not going to let us waltz into that courthouse without a fight." As they began to plan their next moves, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Grayson was ruthless, and if they weren't careful, this would end in bloodshed. But they had no choice. This was their last chance to bring Grayson down and save their city from the grip of corruption. The clock was ticking, and every second brought them closer to a final confrontation. This time, they had to win. The early morning light streamed through the grimy windows of the safe house as Marcus, Chloe, Vanessa, and Ramirez gathered their belongings. The plan was set: they had to reach the courthouse by noon to present their evidence to Judge Harrington. The recording Ramirez had made was their trump card, and getting it to the judge was their last chance to expose Grayson and his criminal network. Chloe tightened the straps on her backpack, where the flash drive and Ramirez's recorder were safely tucked away. "Are we sure this will work?" she asked, her voice laced with anxiety. "What if Grayson finds out before we even get there?" Vanessa checked her phone, scanning for any updates from her contacts. "We have no choice," she said firmly. "We only have a few hours before Judge Harrington leaves for the conference. If we miss this window, Grayson will have all the time he needs to cover his tracks." Marcus looked around at the group, seeing the tension etched on each of their faces. "Everyone ready?" he asked, receiving determined nods in response. "Let's move. Stick to the plan, and we'll get through this." The group split up, with Marcus and Chloe taking one route and Vanessa and Ramirez taking another. The idea was to make it harder for Grayson's men to intercept them. They had to be careful. Grayson had eyes everywhere, and any sign that they were headed to the courthouse could spell disaster. Marcus and Chloe hurried through the crowded downtown streets, trying to blend in with the morning commuters. The courthouse loomed ahead, its imposing stone facade a symbol of justice that felt more like a fortress today. Marcus's nerves were on edge, every glance over his shoulder, every person who brushed past them felt like a potential threat. Almost there, he whispered to Chloe, who nodded, clutching the strap of her bag like a lifeline. "Remember, stay close. If anything happens, you run straight to Judge Harrington's chambers." As they approached the courthouse steps, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb. Marcus's heart leapt into his throat. "Go!" he shouted, pushing Chloe ahead of him as the doors of the SUV flew open and Grayson's men poured out. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them, echoing off the stone walls of the courthouse. Chloe's breath hitched, but she forced herself to keep running. Marcus was right behind her, shielding her as best as he could. The world seemed to move in slow motion, the shouts, the gunshots, the terrified screams of bystanders. Vanessa and Ramirez appeared from the opposite side of the plaza, cutting through the chaos. Vanessa waved frantically, gesturing for Marcus and Chloe to follow. "This way. We've got a clear path," she shouted over the noise. They sprinted toward the side entrance of the courthouse, Vanessa and Ramirez covering them. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and they burst inside, breathless and shaken but alive. The echo of their footsteps filled the marbled halls as they raced toward Judge Harrington's chambers. They had only minutes before the judge was due to leave for his conference. Ramirez led the way, his knowledge of the building proving invaluable as they navigated the labyrinth of corridors. But as they rounded the final corner, two of Grayson's men blocked their path, guns drawn. "Hand over the files, or we'll take you down right here," one of them snarled. Marcus stepped forward, his hands raised. "We're not backing down. If you shoot us, this entire place is crawling with cops who will hear it. You really want that kind of heat?" The men hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. That moment of doubt was all Marcus needed. With a swift, desperate move, he lunged at the nearest thug, knocking his gun aside. Chloe, fueled by adrenaline, grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it at the other man, catching him off guard. "Go! Now!" Marcus yelled at Chloe as he struggled with the thug, the two of them crashing into a row of file cabinets. Chloe didn't hesitate. She sprinted down the hallway, clutching the flash drive and recorder as if her life depended on it. Vanessa caught up to Chloe, pulling her into a small side office. "We're almost there," she panted. "Judge Harrington's chambers are just ahead." Bursting through the door, they found the judge packing up his briefcase. His stern face softened with surprise when he saw the frantic duo. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Harrington demanded. "Your Honor, you need to see this," Chloe said, her voice shaking as she handed over the flash drive and recorder. "It's proof of corruption in the police force, Detective Grayson and his network." Judge Harrington's eyes narrowed as he plugged the flash drive into his laptop. The room was tense, the sound of gunfire still faintly audible from the chaos outside. Chloe held her breath, praying that the files would convince him. As the audio recording played, Grayson's voice echoed through the room, "We'll bury anyone who gets in our way. The city belongs to us." Judge Harrington's face darkened. This is damning evidence," he muttered, closing the laptop. "I'll issue a warrant for Grayson's arrest immediately. But you need to understand, this won't stop with him. You've opened up a Pandora's box." Vanessa nodded. "We know, Your Honor. But if we don't act now, Grayson will continue to destroy lives." Before Harrington could respond, the door to his chambers burst open, and Marcus stumbled in, bleeding from a cut above his eye. "We don't have much time," he gasped. "Grayson's men are inside the building." The judge picked up his phone, barking orders to the courthouse security. "Seal the exits and detain anyone trying to leave," he commanded. "We can't let Grayson slip through our fingers." As they rushed out of the judge's chambers, they were met by a squad of armed security officers who had taken control of the main entrance. Grayson, cornered and desperate, stood in the middle of the lobby, his eyes wild with fury. "You think you can take me down with some flimsy recordings?" Grayson snarled, aiming his gun at Marcus. "I've survived worse than this." But before he could pull the trigger, Ramirez stepped forward, his own weapon trained on Grayson. "It's over, Grayson. Put the gun down. The judge has already issued a warrant for your arrest." For a moment, it seemed like Grayson might fight back. But the sight of courthouse security closing in, along with the knowledge that the evidence was now in the hands of a judge, finally broke him. With a growl of frustration, he threw his gun to the ground. As the security officers cuffed Grayson and led him away, Marcus turned to Chloe, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You did it," he whispered, relief flooding through him. "You saved us." Tears welled up in Chloe's eyes, but she smiled. "We did it," she corrected, her voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. But even as they celebrated, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this victory was just the beginning. Grayson was only one piece of a much larger puzzle, and there were still powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. For now, though, they had won a crucial battle. And with the evidence in the hands of the court, they had dealt a significant blow to the corruption that had plagued their city for far too long. The soft glow of the courthouse lights faded behind them as Marcus, Chloe, Vanessa, and Ramirez walked out into the cold night air. Snow was still falling lightly, coating the city in a quiet blanket of white. They had done it, Grayson was in custody, and Judge Harrington had issued a warrant for his immediate arrest. For a moment, it felt like they had finally won. But as they gathered in the shadow of the courthouse steps, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Grayson's wild eyes as he was dragged away, the hint of a smirk on his lips, it all gnawed at him. It was almost as if Grayson knew something they didn't. "We did it," Vanessa said, her breath visible in the cold air as she tried to catch her breath. "Grayson's going away for a long time." Ramirez nodded, but his expression was tense. "Yeah, but that was too easy," he muttered, glancing around warily. "Grayson's a snake, but he's not the top dog. There's someone else pulling the strings." Marcus turned to Chloe, who was clutching the recorder tightly. "Ramirez is right," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Grayson was ruthless, but he's been protected by people far more powerful. We need to figure out who's really behind all of this. Chloe's eyes widened. You think there's someone higher up, controlling everything? Before Marcus could answer, Vanessa's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face paling as she read the message. We need to move, she said urgently. I just got a tip, Grayson's allies are making moves. They're trying to erase everything we've exposed. What? Marcus asked, his heart sinking. We just got the evidence to the judge. Yeah, but if they have enough influence, they can spin this whole thing, Vanessa said, her eyes flashing with anger. We need to find out who's behind this before they bury everything. They hurried through the snow-covered streets toward Vanessa's apartment, where she kept a backup of all the evidence they had gathered. It was their last line of defense in case Grayson's allies tried to destroy the files at the courthouse. As they entered the cramped, cluttered apartment, Vanessa quickly booted up her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I've been tracing the payments and contracts from Chloe's flash drive, she said, her voice steady despite the urgency. But there's one name that keeps coming up, hidden behind layers of shell companies. Chloe leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the screen. The name Victor Kane keeps appearing in the background, she muttered. I don't recognize it. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Victor Kane. That name sounds familiar. He racked his brain, trying to remember where he'd heard it before. Then it hit him, Victor Kane was one of the most influential businessmen in the city, with connections that reached deep into politics and law enforcement. He was known for keeping a low profile, avoiding the spotlight even as he controlled entire sectors of the city's economy. Are you telling me that Kane is behind this? Ramirez asked, his face contorted with disbelief. He's practically untouchable. Vanessa nodded grimly. If Kane's involved, it means Grayson was just a pawn. Kane has the resources to cover this up and turn it into a smear campaign against us. Marcus clenched his fists. We need something solid, something that ties Kane directly to Grayson and the corruption. If we can expose Kane, we can bring the entire network down. Suddenly, Vanessa's computer pinged. Wait. I just got access to a secure server linked to Kane's companies, she said, her eyes widening as she scanned the files. There are communications here, emails, recordings, even video surveillance logs. Chloe leaned in, her eyes widening as she read through the emails. This is it, she whispered. These emails show Kane ordering Grayson to eliminate anyone who threatened his operations, including the people Chloe overheard talking at her law firm. Ramirez let out a low whistle. We just hit the mother lode. This is exactly what we need. But just as Vanessa began downloading the files, her screen went black. No, 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 she muttered, frantically typing. They're trying to cut me off. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his blood running cold as he read the message, "Stop now, or everyone you care about will pay." They know, Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. They're trying to shut us down. Vanessa cursed under her breath, frantically typing on her keyboard. I've got one chance to get these files out before they lock me out completely. If we can get this to the media, we can expose Kane before he covers his tracks. Do it, Marcus urged. We can't let them win. Chloe stood by the door, peeking through the blinds. We've got company, she hissed. A black SUV just pulled up outside. Ramirez drew his gun. We need to get out of here. Now. The apartment door burst open, splintering as two of Kane's men charged in. Marcus and Ramirez sprang into action, blocking the door as Chloe and Vanessa scrambled to transfer the files to a secure server. Hurry up, Vanessa. Marcus shouted, struggling to hold off one of the men. A punch landed on his ribs, knocking the wind out of him, but he refused to back down. Vanessa's fingers were a blur on the keyboard. Almost there, just a few more seconds. Chloe grabbed a chair and swung it at the second thug, buying Vanessa the time she needed. "It's done!" Vanessa shouted triumphantly. "The files are sent." But just as she spoke, one of the men yanked her away from the desk, smashing the laptop onto the ground. The screen shattered, the final remnants of their evidence disappearing in a cascade of glass and sparks. "It's too late," Chloe said, her voice filled with defiance. "The files are already out there. You've lost." The men hesitated, realizing the gravity of the situation. Kane's entire empire was about to be exposed, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. With a furious growl, they retreated, knowing that whatever they did now, the damage was already done. As the dust settled, Marcus and Chloe stood in the rec department, catching their breath. Ramirez was nursing a cut on his arm, and Vanessa was staring at the shattered remnants of her laptop with a mix of exhaustion and relief. "We did it," Marcus said softly, turning to Chloe. "Kane's empire is crumbling as we speak. The media will be all over this." Chloe nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "But at what cost?" "They'll come after us, Marcus. Kane won't go down without a fight." Marcus put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll face that when it comes. But for now, we've won. We exposed the truth." Vanessa, still panting, smiled faintly. "You just dealt a blow to one of the most powerful men in this city. You've made enemies, but you've also made allies. People are going to rally behind you." As they stepped back out into the snow, Marcus knew that this victory was only temporary. Kane and his allies would regroup, and the fight was far from over. But for now, they had struck a critical blow against corruption. And they were ready for whatever came next. Snowflakes swirled in the cold night air as Marcus, Chloe, Vanessa, and Ramirez approached the towering office building that loomed over the city skyline. It was nearly midnight, and the streets were eerily quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The files they had leaked earlier had thrown the media into a frenzy, but they knew that the final battle was still to come. Inside the glass fortress of Kane Enterprises, Victor Kane was preparing for the fight of his life. Marcus and his team had dealt a devastating blow by exposing his ties to Grayson, but Kane wasn't the type to go down without a fight. He had used his vast resources to erase digital traces, bribe officials, and even silence witnesses, but this time, he had been caught off guard. "This is it," Vanessa said quietly, her breath visible in the frigid air as they gathered outside the building's rear entrance. "Kane knows we're coming, but he won't expect us to hit him this hard." Ramirez adjusted his grip on the gun tucked under his jacket. "We need to be quick. If we're caught, Kane's men will overwhelm us before we reach him." Marcus turned to Chloe, who was visibly shaking, both from the cold and the fear gnawing at her insides. "Chloe, you don't have to do this," he said softly. "You've already done more than enough." But Chloe's eyes were filled with a steely resolve. "I'm not leaving your side, Marcus. I want to see this through. Kane's taken enough from us." Marcus nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "All right. Let's finish this." With Ramirez leading the way, they made their way into the building through a side entrance, avoiding the main security cameras. Vanessa had hacked into the building system earlier, temporarily disabling the alarms, but they knew they had limited time before Kane's private security team would notice the breach. The hallways were dimly lit, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As they navigated the maze of offices and corridors, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Kane was too smart to be taken down so easily. "Where's the security?" Chloe whispered, glancing around nervously. "This place should be crawling with guards." "They're probably regrouping," Vanessa replied. "Kane's stalling us, trying to buy himself time." They reached the executive floor, where Kane's lavish office awaited. The doors were made of thick mahogany, and behind them, they could hear the faint hum of conversation. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded to Ramirez, who kicked the doors open with a single powerful thrust. Inside, Victor Kane stood behind his massive desk, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards. The air was thick with tension, and the smell of expensive cigars lingered in the room. Kane's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos Marcus and his team had unleashed on his empire. "Well, well," Kane said with a cold smile, as if he were greeting old friends. "The heroes have finally arrived. I must say, I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd get this far." "Your game's over, Kane," Marcus said, stepping forward. "We've exposed everything. It's only a matter of time before the authorities come for you." Kane's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "You think a few emails and recordings can bring me down? I own this city, Marcus. And I own everyone in it." Vanessa stepped forward, holding up her phone, which was still live streaming. "Not anymore," she said. "The whole world is watching now. Every word you say is being broadcast live." For the first time, Kane's composure faltered. His eyes darted to the phone, then back to Marcus. "You think I'm afraid of public opinion?" he sneered. "I've survived worse scandals than this." But Marcus had anticipated this. He knew Kane wouldn't be easily intimidated. "What about the people you've silenced?" Marcus pressed, his voice rising. "The families you've destroyed? You can't bribe your way out of this one." Kane's face twisted with rage. "Enough of this," he barked to his guards. "Kill them. Now." The room erupted into chaos as the guards lunged forward. Ramirez pulled out his gun, firing off shots that sent the guards scrambling for cover. Vanessa ducked behind a pillar, desperately trying to keep the live stream going as bullets whizzed past her. Chloe clung to Marcus's side, her heart racing as they took cover behind a large marble statue. "Marcus, what do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We have to get to Kane," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "He's the only one who can call off his men." As Ramirez and Vanessa kept the guards distracted, Marcus and Chloe made a break for it, sprinting toward Kane's desk. Kane's eyes widened as he realized what they were doing, and he reached for a gun hidden in his desk drawer. Before he could fire, Chloe grabbed a heavy paperweight and threw it at him with all her strength. The makeshift weapon struck Kane's hand, sending the gun flying across the room. Marcus tackled Kane, pinning him to the ground. "It's over, Kane," Marcus shouted, wrestling him into submission. "Call off your men." Kane struggled, his face contorted with fury. "You think this ends with me? There are others, more powerful than you can imagine." But Marcus pressed harder, his voice low and menacing. "Maybe. But you're the one going down today." Ramirez and Vanessa had subdued the remaining guards, and Chloe hurried to grab the gun Kane had dropped. With shaky hands, she aimed it at him, her eyes blazing with the pain of everything he had put them through. "You ruined our lives," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You tried to destroy my family." For a moment, Marcus thought she might pull the trigger. But instead, Chloe lowered the gun, tears streaming down her face. "You're not worth it," she said, her voice breaking. Vanessa stepped forward, her phone still recording. "This is the end, Kane. The world knows who you are now." Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police officers stormed the building, arresting Kane and his remaining guards. The media frenzy outside was in full swing, reporters clamoring for the latest scoop on the fall of the city's most powerful man. As Kane was led away in handcuffs, Marcus and Chloe stood together on the courthouse steps, exhaustion etched on their faces. They had won, but the victory felt bittersweet. "You did it," Ramirez said, clapping Marcus on the back. You brought down the biggest fish in the pond. Marcus nodded, turning to Chloe. No, he said softly. We did it. Together. Vanessa joined them, her face alight with a triumphant smile. This story is going to change everything, she said. The city owes you both a debt it can never repay. Chloe smiled faintly, wiping away the last of her tears. I just want to go home, she whispered. I want to finally be able to sleep without looking over my shoulder. As the snow continued to fall, Marcus hugged his sister tightly. The nightmare was over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they could finally begin to heal. But even as they walked away, Marcus knew that this was only one battle in a much larger war. The corruption ran deep, and there would always be others willing to take Cain's place. But for now, they had won a crucial victory. And for now, that was enough.